In California, farmers sometimes do things that, at first glance, just don't make any sense. Imagine a normal field, straight rows of crops, machines going back and forth. Everything looks like standard farming. But then trucks roll in, and they're not bringing fertilizer or soil. They're loaded with food. The trailers are full of apples, carrots, oranges, grapes. And this isn't waste from processing, not rotten leftovers from a landfill. It's normal food, the kind you'd see in a store. There's nothing obviously wrong with it. The truck stops, lifts the trailer, and all that food just gets dumped straight onto the ground. No sorting, no collecting, no sending it anywhere else. It just sits there. And then it gets spread out or buried into the soil. But the strangest part comes next. Someone is paying for this. The farmer isn't getting paid for growing or selling the food. They're getting paid for putting that material back into the soil. And this isn't a one-time thing. It's part of an official system that actually sends out real payments. From the outside, it looks almost stupid. In one of the biggest agricultural regions in the US, food isn't being sold, it's being buried. But once you actually look into it, there are real reasons behind it. To understand how this even happens, you have to look at the scale of it first. California isn't just another state. It's basically the center of US agriculture. According to the California Department of Food and Agriculture, the state produces over a third of all vegetables and about two-thirds of all fruits and nuts in the country. In 2022 alone, the total value of agricultural production went over $59 billion. This is a massive system, running at a scale where even small imbalances turn into millions of tons. And here's the first key point. The system almost always produces more than it can actually sell. That's not a mistake, that's just how it works. Farmers can't predict demand perfectly. They aim higher on purpose, because if they come up short, they lose money. So every season, part of the crop ends up being extra. Then there are the standards. In the US, food has to look a certain way. If an apple is too small, a carrot is a bit crooked, or an orange has a spot, it becomes a problem. A lot of that produce never makes it into supermarkets. Depending on who you ask, up to 20 to 30% of fruits and vegetables in the US don't reach retail just because of appearance and store requirements. Then you add logistics on top of that. Harvesting, storage, transportation, it all costs money. Sometimes it's cheaper to not touch part of the crop at all than to try to sell it. In California, this hits harder because distances are large and quality standards are strict. So you end up with a situation where millions of tons of food technically exist but don't really have anywhere to go. According to the United States Department of Agriculture, tens of millions of tons of food are lost or wasted every year in the US, and a big chunk of that happens right at the farming and distribution stages. Now let's go back to those trucks from the beginning. So what are they actually bringing? It's very specific stuff. Apples that didn't meet size standards, carrots that look off, citrus with cosmetic defects, grapes that didn't sell. And here's the important part. This isn't even spoiled food. Most of it is perfectly fine to eat. It just doesn't meet market standards. It's not dangerous, it's just not pretty enough. So you end up with perfectly good food being dumped onto the ground. Not because it went bad, but because it didn't qualify. When money gets involved, the whole thing starts to feel even more broken. In California, there are programs run through the California Department of Food and Agriculture where farmers can receive payments for practices that return organic material to the soil. But why? At first, it might seem simple. Just a way to get rid of excess. If you can't sell something, you have to put it somewhere. And in that sense, burying food looks like disposal. But here's the problem. Disposal is usually done as cheaply as possible, while the state is actually adding money to the process.
Another angle is waste. In the US, food waste is a huge issue. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, food waste is the largest category of material in landfills. And when it sits there, it breaks down and releases methane, one of the most powerful greenhouse gases. From that perspective, sending food back into agriculture instead of landfills makes sense. Instead of treating it as trash, it becomes a resource. But even here there's a catch. A lot of what ends up in fields never went through a landfill in the first place. This isn't city garbage. This is food that never left the agricultural system. So the system grows food, fails to sell part of it, and then sends it right back into the soil. If you look deeper, it ends up solving multiple problems at once. At first, that's not obvious, which is why the whole thing looks so strange. So what's actually going on? California isn't just paying farmers to get rid of unwanted food. It's paying them to keep organic material out of landfills and return it to the agricultural cycle as a soil input, mainly compost. In the state's Healthy Soils program, this isn't described as dumping fruit in a field, but as supporting practices that increase organic matter in the soil, improve soil structure, and help it hold water. Yeah, trucks dumping piles of food don't look great, but in California, soil has become extremely valuable, and water is limited. So even extra food is now seen not just as a product, but as raw material to keep the land itself working. If you break it down simply, it comes down to this. Healthy soil isn't just dirt you stick plants into. Good soil acts like a sponge. It has structure, pores, organic matter, microbes, root remnants, everything that helps water stay in place instead of running off or disappearing. When soil lacks organic matter, it starts to fail. In some places, it becomes too compact and water just runs off. In others, it dries out too fast. It also loses its ability to hold nutrients properly. When compost gets added, you're not just dumping waste into the soil, you're rebuilding its internal structure. The thing that intensive farming, heat, and constant use slowly break down over time. So what looks like destroying food is actually part of a stricter logic. The state isn't just thinking about this season's harvest. It's thinking about whether these fields will still produce in 5, 10, or 15 years. And that comes down to soil condition. So why did something like compost suddenly become important enough that farmers get paid for it? Because in many parts of California, the soil has been under heavy pressure for decades. When you harvest year after year, remove biomass, plow, irrigate, and keep pushing the same land, it slowly loses what made it alive. You might not see it immediately while crops are still growing, but at a system level, the land becomes more dependent on water and fertilizers, and more fragile overall. That's why compost here isn't some trendy eco add-on. It's a survival tool. The state can't afford to lose fertile land, so paying farmers to maintain it makes sense. And this isn't some small, isolated thing. California is building out an entire infrastructure around organic waste. There are already over 200 processing facilities in operation, with more under construction. Between 2018 and 2021, the state reduced organic waste going to landfills by about 2 million tons per year, and public investment in this system adds up to hundreds of millions of dollars. At that point, this stops looking like some kind of farming trick. It starts looking like a full-scale industrial shift in how waste is handled. California isn't spending money just because it cares about soil. It's because without this system, it can't manage the sheer volume of organic material it produces. Because the scale is just too big. The state has massive agriculture, huge food losses, and a serious problem with what to do with all that organic material. As mentioned earlier, when it ends up in landfills, it produces methane, which adds to the same heat and drought pressure that California farmers are already fighting. And California isn't just producing a lot of food, it's one of the main food engines of the US, responsible for a huge share of fruits, nuts, and vegetables, with tens of billions of dollars in output. So any problem here becomes a big problem fast. If a smaller state loses part of its food supply, that's local. If California starts losing large volumes of organic material and its fields begin to lose their ability to hold water and stay productive, that's a hit to one of the country's main food systems. At that point, compost stops being optional. It starts looking like insurance.
But is this system perfect? Not really.
First, not all organic material is equally useful. You can't just dump raw fruits and vegetables onto a field and call it soil restoration. There are standards, quality, origin, processing methods. Otherwise, instead of benefits, you get odor, salts, weed seeds, contamination, and a whole new set of problems. Second, this isn't cheap, even for the state. Organic material has to be collected, kept separate from trash, processed, transported, distributed, and monitored. That's why California had to build out a network of facilities. Without that, the idea of returning organics to the soil stays just a nice concept. If you put it all together, here's what you get. In California, food now has two roles. When it's sold, it's a product. When it isn't, it becomes a resource for the soil. And the more you look at it not as some green idea, but as a system under pressure, the more it starts to make sense. If you zoom out to the rest of the US, California isn't the only place where food stops being just food. There's another state where this idea has been pushed even further: Vermont. Since 2020, Vermont has a law that basically bans sending food waste to landfills. Residents, restaurants, stores, farms, everyone has to separate food waste and send it to composting or processing. This isn't optional. It's a requirement that was phased in starting in 2012 and fully enforced by 2020. On the surface, it just looks like normal waste sorting. Separate bins, collection services, nothing unusual. But what happens next is the key. The food doesn't disappear. It goes back to farms. Food scraps are mixed with manure, wood chips, and plant material, processed into compost, and then returned to the soil to grow new crops. For example, the University of Vermont alone sends around 15 tons of food waste per week for processing. What used to go to landfills is now raw material. Across the whole state, that adds up to thousands of tons of organic matter being recycled into agriculture. And here, the same effect shows up as in California, but even stronger. In California, it's a choice with incentives. In Vermont, it's no longer a choice. The state forces food waste back into the system. Food is no longer the end product. It becomes part of a loop. There's another state doing something different with the same problem: Massachusetts. The state basically took the biggest food waste stream and blocked its road to the landfill. Since 2014, there's a rule there. If a company generates more than 1 ton of food waste per week, it cannot send it to a landfill. That applies to supermarkets, universities, large restaurants, warehouses, anywhere with high food volumes. But here, composting isn't always the main solution. Massachusetts leans heavily on anaerobic digestion. If you put it simply, food waste goes into sealed tanks without oxygen, where it breaks down and produces gas. That gas can then be used for energy. In other words, food waste gets turned into usable energy. So across different states, the same thing is happening in different ways. In California, the state pays farmers to improve soil. In Vermont, food waste is pushed back into the system. In Massachusetts, it's turned into energy. In all cases, food stops being the final product. It becomes part of a system that keeps working even after it's not sold or eaten. And when you look at all of this together, it stops looking like a bunch of strange ideas. It's different responses to the same problem: too much food, too much waste, and too high a cost to just ignore it. This is the new normal.